So you mentioned about being South Asian, and you felt like that almost meant you had to be even better at it to kind of justify it. And I remember I was reading on your website. I know when we spoke in Chicago, you were talking a bit about how you were kind of considering the industry of going into medicine.
Hmm.
So could you talk a bit about that? How that first arose like as a career pathway, and how come that didn't materialize completely?
Absolutely. So, as you know, family full of doctors. My mom herself is a pediatrician. I have an aunt who's an oncologist. I have an uncle who does research in cancer. I have an aunt who works with special needs children. So while she's an educator, it still has a bit of a medical side point to it. And I have another aunt that's a dentist, and that's all my mom's siblings. So it was definitely around me, and I definitely had an interest in it. I was in every science class you could imagine in high school. I did internships at the National Institutes of Health, which is where, like, the gurus go. And I was doing that as a teenager. So it wasn't needed to say that, someone had forced me into the idea of doing medicine. I actually was really into it. Um, However, when I was in my first year of undergraduate studies, I learned very quickly that it was more about grades, the marks you made on papers, your exam scores, and not so much about learning. And I was more about the learning, especially when I was in those internships. You would do your research, you compiled a paper or a presentation, and then you did a poster presentation. And it didn't matter what happened in the experiment. Let's say you had a bad result or a good result. It was something to still be proud of because it just showed this journey of learning. And I remember having a peer tell me that if you had a 3.6 grade point average, don't even bother applying to medical school because you won't even have your application looked at. So when you have that in your head from the very get go, and you're just worried about making A's on everything, you kind of lose the desire to learn. And that's what it was for me. I didn't feel like I was learning for learning. I felt like I was learning just to take a test. Um, because of that, I actually switched to engineering for a year and a half. My dad's an engineer, and I was always into aeronautics, and I love airplanes, so I wanted to go into engineering. And I learned by my third semester that maybe this isn't a good idea because vector calculus showed its ugly face, and my grades were not the best. So at that point, I understood my limitations within that discipline. And around that time, I just, wanted that time I was doing still doing viola in school. I had a music scholarship, and I was my teachers were giving me a lot of opportunities just to do really well. And I was just thinking in the back of my head, why am I not doing this? This is something I enjoy. Even when I'm having a very not so good day, I still like to pick up the instrument and play. Even if I'm not necessarily practicing for something, I at least play. And that's sort of what fueled me into switching into music. I had done this big performance with my teachers at undergrad. I got into this statewide music performance competition, and I was just really enjoying the work I was doing. I loved my journey through the instrument, and that is why I switched from medicine to engineering, which was this bridge, and then to music, and I haven't looked back since then.
Yeah. Did you ever feel there was like a expectation or added pressure on you to go into a more academic industry, considering like a lot of your family are into that sort of thing?
100%. And it wasn't really just the family, it was also just this community that we're a part of in Dallas. Um, you know, it, when I told my parents I wanted to go into music, my mom's initial reaction wasn't so much like, how are you going to make this into a viable career? She was more concerned about what others were going to say because that's just what happens in South Asian culture. It's so collectivist that we value other people's opinions before realizing what's good for our own lives. So that influenced some amount of pressure, but also there were not that many people in the arts discipline immediately around me that were, of South Asian heritage. So that's where I was a bit of a misfit, if you will. And I didn't, it, that was sort of hard to wrap around. And I kind of would always take people's criticisms and, feel a bit bad about it. Now I'm sort of realizing that, hey, this is something that gives me that sense of fulfillment I've always wanted. So why should I worry about what other people are saying? They're not necessarily paying my bills or giving me that sense of fulfillment. This is. So at that point, I kind of was able to shed away that pressure, and I don't feel it anymore to this day.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, that must be quite difficult if you got all the people around you quite not kind of pushing you in one direction, especially like it takes a lot of self-belief to decide that although all these people are telling me I need to go into this industry, you must be quite confident in your own ability that you can do this as a career.
One thing I definitely realized was you learn a lot about people around you when you're doing something that's different, in the sense that people are always okay with what is considered normal or the status quo. As soon as you start to do things that either will make someone uncomfortable or just out of the ordinary, the cliche way of putting it, then you kind of see how people react to you. And it's how you handle their reactions determines how you go forward, because if you have that sense of conviction in what you're doing, your other people's opinions won't bother you. If you are not fully confident in what you are doing, that random auntie or uncle is going to say something and it's going to keep you up at night. And
Yeah.
I never let that happen to me. It was, if my family said something, that was a different story. But if it was, the like the person you meet once a week at the mosque, it never bothered me.
Yeah, wow. So like away from like the kind of community expectation, what about kind of the other sacrifices you had to make? Because I know you're very dedicated and you put a lot of hours into what you do. That's the only way like
Mhm.
you can be as successful as you are so far. So what were the some of the sacrifices you had to overcome along the way?
I think so. One thing about being in subjects like medicine and engineering, you tend to find a lot of people in your own cultural background, and that kind of keeps your sense of identity, and you feel like that bit of protection being with people that are like you in that sense. Because when you're in a place like the UK or the US where you have all these mix of cultures, you kind of tend to gravitate towards people that are like you. Um, being in the arts, however, I found there was very little bit of South Asian representation just in general. So I felt distant from people that I'd sort of gotten close to along the way as we were being tortured by our calculus assignments. Um, but when I think about it, at the end of the day, they were still supportive, but then I also at the same time noticed that some of them were like, why are you switching? You should see this through, even though you don't like it, because that's the mentality that everybody had coming from our culture. So I mean, yeah, maybe I lost a few people that I considered close along the way, but at the same time, I met other people that I could be close to. And because we were all connected through arts, I felt like the connection was deeper. So it was kind of, I think the big sacrifice for me was kind of sort of dealing with my cultural identity while dealing with something that was so different at the same time.